In 1938, David Haig-Thomas led a pioneering British Arctic expedition across Greenland and Canada. In 2015, his great-nephew followed in his footsteps to the island his great-uncle discovered. Alec Greenwell will tell us about the Haig-Thomas Expedition 2015, from Greenland to Canada. Alec, thank you.
Wow. The bar's been set high. It was back in 2011 that I collared my good friend Ed Cooper on the gravel outside my home. We'd just finished an expedition called the Engelanda Expedition, in which we had tried to kayak across the North Sea to follow in the footsteps of some heroic Dutch civilians who had escaped to occupied Holland to come and fight for the British Army. I asked him vaguely what he knew about the Arctic, and I gave him a book to read. The book was called Tracks in the Snow, and it was written by my great-uncle, David Haig-Thomas. Now, David was quite an interesting man. He'd cheated his way through Eton and went on to Cambridge, where his rowing career began, a career that took him eventually all the way to the LA Olympics in 1932. Following a disappointing fourth-place Olympic finish, he met up and travelled with an old school friend, Wilfred Thesiger, through Abyssinia. It was a highly unsuccessful trip for David, who was left badly injured and swearing to himself to travel as far from the heat of Africa as possible. It was on this thought that that took him all the way to the Arctic. Now, the book is all about his second expedition there to Greenland and the Canadian Arctic. It's the British Arctic Expedition of '37. He led the expedition, and officially the remit was to map Ellesmere Island and to conduct research on behalf of the Swiss Glacier Institute on the ozone layer, which was remarkably forward-thinking for the time. But unofficially, David had heard rumours that there was a prehistoric dinosaur skeleton in the area, and his intention was to discover it. Now, the skeleton has actually been discovered since, but proved elusive for David. He did, however, find this tiny little speck of land just southwest of Axel Heiberg, which had previously been unmapped. He named it Neville Chamberlain Island. Uncharitably, one might suspect of attempting to garner favour from the Prime Minister at the time. However, this has subsequently been renamed Haig-Thomas Island, so perhaps favour was not forthcoming. I'd first read this book when I was 14, and I remember clearly one day pugnaciously telling my mother that I was going to head to this island one day. 14 years later, Ed and I crossed the tide crack to Haig-Thomas Island in Nunavut in Canada. We'd walked 450 kilometres, and it had taken us 4.5 years to get there. David's expedition had started in Dundas, a small village on the west coast of Greenland. This village, along with several others, had been forcibly relocated with 3 days' notice to a town called Karnak, 40 miles north, by the Americans in the 50s. It was here in Karnak that we spent our first 2 months interviewing hunters on behalf of Copenhagen University, preparing ourselves and our kit, and generally learning how not to die. Karnak is a fascinating place, and we were keen to discover how much life had changed since David had been there. The answer is not a huge amount. The houses are somewhat sturdier now, but as you can see, the habits were roughly the same. Dog sled was the main form of transport, and fishing and hunting the chief profession. All too soon, our departure date arrived, and we were picked up and flown with several unscheduled stops to Eureka Sound Weather Station, where we'd be departing from. We were given a stark warning on our very first night about what we'd be up against as I glanced up from digging a hole in the snow to see an enormous white dog just 10 feet away from me, head down, watching me very closely. Not quite gathering what was going on, I swung around to point it out to Ed, and in doing so saw another and another and another, and all in the same hunched position. I became suddenly aware of a further 15 or so wolves that had surrounded us silently as we fumbled with frozen fingers. The wildlife photographer Vincent Munier happened to be on site to capture this photo from the weather station. Happily, they seemed to decide that they'd made their point and trotted off shortly afterwards, but Ed and I were on our guard from this moment on. Where am I now? David had used dogs to travel from Greenland over the sea ice. Excuse this terrible map. That is Greenland, and that is Canada. He was able to just slide across the ice, but that's no longer possible without a boat. So we had to pick up his route at the bottom of Eureka Sound, which is just here. Now, the first 2 weeks were dominated by weather and distance. Reading through my diary, I talked of little else but homesickness and cold. I had one rather emotional day where I had one eye frozen shut for an hour thanks to a cruel combination of these factors. The cold was worse than we had imagined. In Greenland, at a similar latitude, we had seen the temperature steadily rise from about -30 in February to -15 in April, and we had naively assumed that Ellesmere would be similar, and we were sorely mistaken. The ice the cold took grip of everything. Bullets froze in our guns, circuit boards shattered, our tent zip was a daily struggle, and our water bottles regularly demanded the use of an ice axe to open, if they would open at all. Ed also began to break at this point, with his fingers becoming pretty gross. We found ourselves shivering each night and reading to one another in our sleeping bags. We used our limited book inventory as medical, meteorological, and practical reference guides almost every day, the most useful of which was an account of Tom Crean. Many of you will know then that our reference material was 100 years old and based on literally the furthest point in the world from where we were. Nevertheless, we were able to discern that Ed's fingers probably wouldn't fall off, and that my bout of snow blindness ought to be treated with cocaine under the eyelids. Soon, however, and thankfully, temperatures began to rise, and with it our moods. The sun was out, with the sun out and the miles sliding behind us. It actually became quite fun at points. But soon, when we were finally able to dry our sleeping bags and stop the hot water bottles freezing in our feet. However, it was about this time that we began to get unwelcome visits from bears. David Haig-Thomas relied on bears as food for him and his dogs, though the tables were very nearly turned by one particularly aggressive bear. We had cunningly brought our own food with us, and so wanted no trouble. However, we did encounter 14 along the way. Of these, only 3 managed to sneak up on us, and thus required serious action. The first was certainly the scariest. As you can see from this picture, he was almost on top of us when I poked my head out of the tent to see what was going on. It took everything in our arsenal to get this bear away. I took this picture, God knows why, after about 5 minutes after yelling at this poor bear. Clearly, we did scare it off eventually, but it certainly put the wind up at us. A few days later, we picked up a new problem: snow blindness. We were crossing a series of fjord mouths at the south of Axel Heiberg. These were around 20 kilometers wide, which is more or less what we'd walk in a day, and therefore required us to take the whole day to cross it. We didn't like sleeping on the ice because the bears tended to come when we were there. Unfortunately, we had a total whiteout for the length of this part of the trip, with only a couple of 100 meters visibility. So being so close to the pole, the compass variation was 30 degrees plus, so they were useless for navigating. So the only method we could find of navigating at a reasonable pace was to strain your eyes and pick out a different shade of white on a patch of snow in front of you, and then stare at it and walk to it, unblinking, until you got there, at which point you would check behind you again, to see if you're going in the right direction, and then find a new patch of snow and repeat. After 3 days of this, my eyes caught fire and didn't stop for another 5 days after. There's a sensation of sort of having sandy eye sockets. Following a 2-day stop to recover and wearing a scarf as eyewear, we struck out for Haig-Thomas Island. we only allowed ourselves to recognize that we might be successful in our objective as we passed the tide crack to the island, an achievement which Ed promptly celebrated by falling over. So finally, after 24 days of walking and 6 days ahead of schedule, we arrived at Haig-Thomas Island. 4.5 years after we'd begun, we'd finally made it. The island itself was tiny. We walked the length and breadth of it in a morning, and unremarkable in almost every way except, for me, in its history. David Haig-Thomas had left a note, and we'd harboured a hope that we might find it. Sadly, it turned out that someone else had just left a heartbreakingly empty crate of whiskey at the top. Nevertheless, the trip was an unmitigated success. We were able to hear and experience and see all the things that I'd been dreaming of for the 14 years previously. Thank you.